He's like, and then wait.
I know. I must have given him that face that I give you when you keep talking and talking. So apparently there's a face.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Face.
Keep talking. What? Come on, please. I love how you reference that to JB. Oh, you like to talk just as much as we do.
I know.
Jeez. I am talking out of necessity, I'll have you know. When I'm at home, sometimes I don't like to talk at all. Okay?
Yeah.
So.
Did he close the garage door?
I don't think so.
I can't hear it.
Matt, you haven't closed the garage yet.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
Matt, we're laughing about you right now.
Yeah, I didn't realize he's going to listen to this. I know. I'll stop the recording and restart it because I know.
Good idea. I know.
Okay, I think we're good. All right.
I think it's a new year. You should start saying something other than welcome in.
Okay. Well, you can say that after I welcome us in. Right. Okay.
When you open the door for somebody else.
Welcome in, everybody, to the vaccine conversation. It's a new year. You're laughing already. Why are you laughing, Melissa?
Happy New Year, everyone. I really am hoping that Dr. Bob can, in this new year, come up with a new expression for how to welcome all of our lovely guests to this podcast.
I will work on that. Let's see what I come up with the next episode.
By 2020, you'll get it ready.
But it's a new year. Welcome back. We're very happy to be here. We kind of missed doing this. I know when we would be texting, over the Christmas holiday, we're both like, oh my gosh, when can we do the next one?
I was like looking out the window, just like a lonely child with raindrops. When is the next podcast?
No, so yeah, why don't you, how was Christmas for you, Melissa? Besides
Christmas was relaxing.
Sick children and...
Well, I only had one sick child,
okay.
and she just had a cold from school, and so we laid low this Christmas just in general. I didn't want it to get any worse. I didn't want her to be exposed to a lot of the stuff that's going around. So we literally did almost nothing the entire Christmas. So I will say there's some cabin fever happening. Okay. And I'm excited to be out. And the funny thing is, my husband was like, what am I going to do with them while you're gone? I was like, it's 3 hours. That's it. These are your children. And I mean, he's like, if I can't, because we don't do screen time, no meat, no movies and stuff, only if they're sick. And so, coincidentally, every time I leave the house, sometime a movie comes on, whenever he's watching them. So I said, no movies, no anything. He's like, but what am I going to do with them? I'm like, what do you think I do with them for 10 hours every day? It's only 3 hours, dude. Get a grip, get a hold of yourself.
Well, I've been there, Steve. I've been there. I feel you, buddy. I know what it's like.
No excuses.
Like.
How about you? How was your Christmas?
Oh, it was great. Oh yeah, our 2 kids visited from North Carolina, 2 of our grown-up kids, and all our kids were around. All 5 of them now. 2 of them have married into the family, and yeah, it was a house full of grown-up children.
Of young adults.
And, yes.
And, young adults.
It was fun. Cheryl just loves family. She just loves having the kids around, as do I. And so it was a real blessing. It's a great time.
My mom's that way. She likes people around more than not having them around. Yeah. And I tend to like my alone time. So I don't know what it's going to be like when my kids are older. But as of now, it was like, yay, I get to get out for 3 hours. So that was this morning.
Yeah, and you guys, we are all honored, Melissa, that your 3 hours are being spent with all of us.
You are welcome.
I know, we are.
I do want to say I'm so excited about all of the listens that we've had.
Oh, yeah.
The auditory processing that's happened as a result of this podcast. There have been, 15,000 downloads, I think, by now since we started this, which is amazing. And I'm really happy that this resonates with some people, that the stuff we're talking about is interesting. It makes them ask more questions. They're opening it up, the conversation with their friends and family. And, this is we're just trying to make people ask questions and to bring to the table information that they may have otherwise not been exposed to. And, this is we're not giving advice. We're not telling people what to do or what to think. It's just, if you only have limited information, then your viewpoint, your belief system is also going to be limited. And my biggest thing has has always been just understanding why there's another side to this. I have family members, friends, people who are very, very set in their opinions, and I really just don't think they understand or even are aware of the entire other side to this conversation.
Yes.
And I really think if people knew more, they could have that compassion, they would have more understanding, and they would understand we're not trying to make everything difficult for people. In fact, our lives have become more difficult as a result of being on this side.
Yes.
But all we're trying to do is do what is right and just and fair and ethical, which is to provide and allow for all of the information to be available on each subtopic that we talk about. All of this information should be accessible to all parents. You can ultimately choose whatever you want. Choose to go whatever way you want to go with it, with your healthcare practitioner, your family, but at least have the pool of information to go from. So that's the reason I like doing this, and I'm really so happy other people are so positively impacted from our podcast so far. That makes me very happy.
Yeah, that is it helps us feel, I don't know, just more joyful about the time we spend here, and we have fun doing it, which is what I love. Along the lines of what you just said, my kind of passion is to try to end the discrimination against families who choose a more natural style of raising their children. And I know a lot of our listeners already are geared towards that way of raising their kids. And so I think one thing all of our listeners can do with this podcast is share, pick a specific episode that you think will reach someone that you know and love, who you feel like needs to hear this message. Maybe someone who has, you told you they don't want to be your friend anymore because you don't vaccinate, or a family member who won't let you come over because you don't vaccinate, or, anyone who really doesn't understand the choices you've made. Let them listen to one of these podcasts, and you might open their eyes to help them understand how you feel better, and they might embrace you again as a family member or a friend, which sounds terrible, but it happens all over
also,
the
if you
place.
partially vaccinate, it's not people should understand there's still such a very small number of people who completely do not vaccinate their children. And I know that's the big fear, that there are so many families of completely unvaccinated children, but in reality, most kids are partially vaccinated. In fact, many of the vaccine-injured children and ones that are pro-informed consent now were people who vaccinated. So, or their children are partially vaccinated, like my first. So some of the people are being discriminated against because they're opting out of one vaccine, two vaccines, or maybe they're fully up to date, and maybe their child is 10, so 10 years ago, the schedule is a little different, but maybe they're fully up to date, but still believe in the right for informed consent and choice for families because everybody's different. So those people are still being discriminated against. It's not like you're just, parents of unvaccinated children who are potentially causing all this risk and you're being discriminated against, and people are like, yeah, well, I understand that, which of course we know that shouldn't be true, because unvaccinated children can be extremely healthy. My second child is vaccine free, and he is so much healthier than my daughter, in fact.
Right, which is kind of funny. It ties into today's topic, because as you were talking about how your daughter was sick, but your son did not get sick.
Right.
Is he turned 3 yet?
Not yet.
No, he's almost 3. Mm-hmm. He's still breastfeeding. Mm-hmm. And I shouldn't say it that way, like it's crazy that he's still breastfeeding. Because my kids nursed till they were 3.5. But I wonder if the reason your son didn't get sick is because he's still nursing, and then that helps protect people from diseases, and that's kind of what today's topic is today. Actually, Melissa put together a whole bunch of research about the role of breastfeeding in preventing infectious disease, and so I think we thought we'd maybe shift away from like a direct vaccine topic and talk about an immune system topic.
But of course, it is
and
totally
it does
related
tie into vaccines.
It is, and the reason it ties in is because the Center for Disease Control, their goal in life, right? Their job, their mission is to reduce the cases of infectious disease and to keep diseases at bay. And so what it's turned into is basically only doing that through vaccines. But the truth is we have lots of other research that shows us that there are other ways to keep kids disease-free. or if they were to encounter diseases, to encounter them mildly and without complication. Because again, we live in a society right now where people assume if you were to catch any of the illnesses that are on our vaccine schedule, then you are going to die from them. Instead of understanding that many people can catch them, process them through their body without complication, and move on in their life with their full immunity.
Right, and breastfeeding helps your body do that. Helps your body handle these illnesses. But I love what you're saying about the CDC. I mean, I think the CDC basically, when it comes to disease prevention, they tell us to vaccinate and to wash our hands and cover your cough. That's the extent of it.
And vaccinate again.
Right? yes. But excuse me. Gosh, sorry, audience. But whereas there's this whole realm of preventive medicine and nutrition that is available to every family that the CDC largely ignores, as far as what I can see. That should be maybe one of their first things they say. But they have. Yes, the CDC does promote breastfeeding, but you know what? But barely.
They do, and like I told you the other day, they have their list of contraindications for breastfeeding. Which I almost had to laugh. Like, in what circumstance could breastfeeding ever be contraindicated for a baby? And the only one that made sense to me was if there was this rare genetic condition where they're not able to metabolize any kind of milk, including human milk. But the rest of the contraindications were diseases that the mother might have that could transmit.
Right.
So in which case, the CDC should be saying, these are the circumstances where the mother should not breastfeed, but the child should get breast milk from a donor or from another mother that is healthy, because the child still needs to get breast milk.
Right, and the CDC doesn't promote the use of someone else's breast milk. Right. So,
it doesn't at all. And I will say, so both of my kids have been breastfed for an extended period of time. Serenity was breastfed for over 4 years, 4.5. And so she's the one that she had her several vaccine reactions. She is the one that gets sick more frequently, even with extended breastfeeding, which I think the breastfeeding definitely helped it not be worse than it was as it related to her reactions and her body's ability to detoxify. But also, she still is weaker than my son. Like, it is so obvious in my household with the same circumstance, the same food, the same everything, same sleep routines. And anybody who knows me knows I'm such a stickler about sleep routines, because I believe sleep is so crucial to development and behavior balance. And anyway, it's like I have a case study in my house, because I have these two kids, both been breastfed. Both environments have been exactly the same kind of food, same kind of supplementation. The only difference is that one of them has had 19 doses of vaccines in her first year and the other one has had none. And such a difference that I see. So even with the breastfeeding, such a difference I see with immune system health.
Right. And you know what the I think what the critics would say is, you were just an anecdote. Your situation is just one family, two kids. It can't possibly be true that your second child is healthier because he has not had vaccines. That can't possibly be true. And what I want to say as a pediatrician, I get the privilege of sitting with thousands of families like Melissa's family and hearing the exact same thing over and over again. I would say I've heard probably 10,000 such anecdotes in my office. And so we always like to ask, at what point does an anecdote actually become data?
Data, right.
And science that you can actually use. And so I suspect what you're saying is true, and because I do see it in my office every day.
Considering some of these research studies that they use to promote the particular narrative contain only 30 kids in them, and that's considered a research study. I find that odd that we can have this many, thousands of, I know hundreds of families just in Southern California that have this same story. And we absolutely know immune system strength. And we'll do another episode just on immune system strength, because I'm so interested in immune system strength, how we can nurture that and how we can prepare our kids to best handle infections, any infection that comes, because of course we know there are so many infections we do not vaccinate for.
Right.
And we'll talk in another episode about the flu season from last year, but what they did say in that data was only about 20% of the lab confirmed tests were influenza, which means 4 out of 5 people that were seeking medical treatment did not have influenza, but they had another type of respiratory infection,
Right.
one that led them to the hospital. That means one that could have also led to a fatality. And so it's not just what we vaccinate against. It is everything that we are presented with. And the best thing that we can do is to, allow our children's bodies to be as strong as possible so that they're able to counteract the effects, the negative effects, and potential complications. And of course, to me, the first place to start with that, and the most important place to start, would be breastfeeding. And like you said, the CDC mentions it. You hear about, they recommend breastfeeding for 6 months. And the World Health Organization recommends it for 2 years.
2 years, yeah.
For global communities. So, of course, this is the place that we should start. But what I think the most recent number I found was about 75% of babies are breastfed in the first month. And that number drops dramatically down by after month 2. To where in some communities, it's only about 5 to 10% of kids are still exclusively breastfed by 6 months.
Wow.
And so you realize that even in developed countries, something with all this access to information, this is not necessarily something that's happening. And we're talking about exclusively breastfed because there are a lot of supplementation that's happening in those first 6 months. And it's crazy, but what most of these studies said that I came across, if not all of them, anything that mentioned supplementation said that the benefits came with exclusive breastfeeding only as it related to disease prevention. And again, all of the studies we're going to talk about with this have to do with breastfeeding and how it reduces disease and infant mortality.
Right. And of course, while partial breastfeeding helps, any amount of breast milk is better than none. When it comes to the benefits of exclusive breastfeeding, it's really basically happens because when an infant ingests an artificially, we call it breast milk substitutes, artificial breast milk substitutes is what the official term is, or formula. It basically disrupts the gut, your gut membrane, your gut permeability. Your gut is lined with just this amazing immune system that protects us. And when a baby eats something foreign to the baby's body, it basically disrupts that gut barrier, and that's even like one bottle of formula will disrupt that gut immune system for days,
and making that baby then more susceptible. Yeah.
Right.
And I'm sure most of these listeners have heard a lot about the gut and brain connection, and how so much of illness that we're seeing, especially chronic illness, and even with vaccine injuries, has to do with gut health and damage to the gut, and how it's connected to the brain, how it connects to behavior. And so it's really important to understand what you're saying, that in those first several months, priming the baby's body, priming their gut with the appropriate strength to handle infections will set them up for strength in the future. And as the CDC wants a population to be disease-free, it starts when you're young too. You can't just be taking your vitamins now as an adult and go, hey, I'm covered. Part of what makes people susceptible is the foundation that they had. And this is why it's so important to talk about breastfeeding. And I know this can be kind of a touchy topic for some people. And I've written about this in different forums. The one thing I will say is if somebody's choosing not to breastfeed, the first option should really be donor milk. And that's not something you're ever really told. I mean, my pediatrician never told me about that. I mean, they sell formula in the offices. And so what happens with that is it's like, oh, don't put too much stress on yourself. You're already doing enough. Here, come take this. This is fine. This is okay. And what I would suggest is, as a society, especially with the help of the CDC and our government agencies, to promote support of women, because there are a lot of women that struggle with breastfeeding. Because trust me, it's hard. It's not easy. I've been breastfeeding for almost 5.5 years straight. And it's not easy. It's a huge commitment, and it requires the loss of your physical liberty, your personal space. There's so many things that are affected. Your nutrients. Like I literally was just recently tested and just completely depleted in so many minerals because, your body has been giving so much. It's not an easy thing. And I had supply issues very early on. And I was even thinking when my first was about 3-4 months, I'm going to have to supplement. I was so stressed out about not producing enough milk. And I did not get the kind of support that would have said, hey, don't worry. This is okay. What you're dealing with is okay. We're going to help support you. And here's what we can do. Here are your options. Never once did they even talk about how it could prevent diseases if we continue with breastfeeding and how crucial it was for the child. And that's, here in developed nation, they're not even talking about this either. And this is a problem, I think, because we have data, actual research, peer-reviewed journals, studies, and articles that all say that starting out with 6 months of breastfeeding exclusively can reduce greatly, and we'll go into the specifics of these different studies and what they say, of their infant mortality, the risk to these children. And so isn't that what we all want? We all want to keep our children safe. We all want to keep babies from being affected and having complications from serious infections when they're, under 6 months, they're at extreme risk. And isn't that by design, kind of what nature set up for us to allow breastfeeding to be there and to be the little support system until that child was at a place where they could get strong enough? And it's not about nutrition and calories. We're talking about something that is on a much higher level, disease prevention, preventing infant mortality.
Right. Well, you want to jump into some of these? I think.
What did you write down? Were you writing something?
Well,
down?
no, I was. I wanted to, I guess, just touch. We know that some people, start off trying to breastfeed and they experience a lot of problems and challenges, and some don't continue to breastfeed, and I guess we want to be sensitive to people, but we also want to share information and share what the real medical information is. So I feel like sometimes people are afraid to promote breastfeeding because you don't want to hurt someone else's feelings. And I think my angle is I know some people listening to this will not have breastfed their babies. You can still learn from this, understand kind of what the science is. This might help maybe encourage you with your next children or encourage you with your grandchildren.
Or friends and family members.
Yeah, friends and family. So I feel like because the data is here, we do want to talk about it. And even though that it might be touchy for some people, I think that doesn't change the fact that we need to talk about it, and the CDC should be talking about it more than they are. So yeah, go.
Well, I think so too. And also, should we be so afraid of what people call shaming and judging? Should we be so afraid of that we're not supporting and sharing information that could be useful not just for the mother, but also for that child? I'm not going to be afraid, because I'm not trying to say that somebody is a bad or wrong person for having fed their baby with formula at a time. That was with the information that they had at that time. And my biggest concern is that they're not given the information. Their pediatricians, their OBGYNs are not arming them with this kind of data to say, you know what, it's going to be hard. It's going to be challenging. And everybody has to go through that. I mean, it's not easy for anybody. That's the thing. The people that have breastfed for their children more than one child or for extended breastfeeding, they agree with all of the complaints about breastfeeding. It's hard. It's inconvenient. There are so many things it is. But if we really did get the information from our healthcare providers that said, listen, commit to the 6 months. Commit to the 6 months because you will greatly reduce the infant mortality risk for your child. If there's a struggle, we'll work through it together. If we had that mentality, and that doesn't just go for breastfeeding, that goes for the CDC and how they approach our health and wellness overall. We really need to start looking at this from a whole body perspective. We need to get out of the way of worrying about offending someone or somebody's feelings getting hurt, and let's just get to the information. There's not a label attached with any of this, just like there isn't a label with being anti-vaccine, pro-vaccine, all those labels. Labels don't work. Let's just get to the information. Right. And so here's what some of the information said. Well, I'll quote the World Health Organization first. They said, a lack of breastfeeding, and especially a lack of exclusively breastfeeding during the first half year of life, are important risk factors for infant and childhood morbidity and mortality. And again, this is the purpose of the CDC, right? To prevent, or it should be, to be worried about infant and child mortality, not just preventing the cases of disease, like you mentioned in a previous thing. Their goal is to prevent the numbers of each individual infectious disease, but it should be to increase the health and wellness of the population, which will reduce the infant mortality and morbidity.
Right.
And I went through a whole bunch of studies, by the way. I think I have maybe 18 here. And
Yeah.
I just there are just little, we'll trade off and kind of read off just the most important fact that I found from each of these things. The first one says this. It says the greatest and most obvious benefits of breastfeeding are for the immediate health and survival of the infant. Rates of diarrhea, respiratory tract infections. How do you pronounce that?
It's otitis media.
I thought so. Okay,
ear
otitis media.
infections.
Okay.
Yeah.
I thought that was it.
Good thing to have a doctor around.
Isn't it? And other infections as well as deaths due to these diseases are all lower in breastfed than in non-breastfed infants. So we're talking about these are the things that are at risk for fatalities, right? Diarrhea, respiratory tract infections, and other infections, and deaths due to these diseases. It says during the first 6 months, the rates are lower for exclusively breastfed than for partially breastfed infants. These benefits resulting from stronger immunity and reduced exposure to infectious agents are greatest in younger infants and where hygiene and sanitation are poor. However, the research described here also suggests that these health and survival benefits extend beyond infancy and to well-off Western populations. Mm-hmm. So for the people who think that the World Health Organization is encouraging breastfeeding past 6 months because of underdeveloped nations, what this study tells you is this is not just about infancy. This extends beyond infancy, and this is also true for Western well-off populations.
Right.
Which means everyone.
Yes.
Everyone.
Yep.
And you read you can see the list of the different potential dangers that breastfeeding is proven to reduce exposure to.
Right, and some of these data, they've sort of tabulated a lot of this information, and basically they're predicting that the deaths of over 800,000 children and 20,000 mothers each year could be averted through universal breastfeeding, along with an economic savings of $300 billion. That's pretty amazing. I don't know if that's every year. Oh, yeah, each year. Yeah, so the World Health Organization and the studies are showing we could save the lives of 800,000 children and 20,000 mothers, worldwide.
And then the 20,000 mothers come from ovarian and breast cancers prevention from breastfeeding earlier in life.
Exactly.
So this is how they've equated it.
The research has shown the more years a woman spends breastfeeding, the lower her rate of breast cancer and other cancers.
Right, reproductive cancers.
Right, but also economic savings of $300 billion. I mean, think of what we could do with $300 billion.
It's significant.
As a society. So,
but we're talking about almost 1 million children, though. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you think about, there aren't even that many children, definitely not in industrialized nations, that are dying from the particular vaccine-preventable diseases. 1 million of them. So that's a significant number. When if our goal is to save lives, then why isn't this the first thing that anybody's talking about?
Right.
That's the thing I want to know.
Right.
So read the next one.
Yep. Well, actually, I want to say a lot of people will say that the promotion of vaccines by the CDC is largely driven by money, and by there is a lot of financial links between pharmaceutical companies who make vaccines and CDC who promotes the vaccines, and so the people will kind of claim that the CDC is just focusing on vaccines because of money. But I wonder if the CDC could save the world and the World Health Organization could save the world $300 billion every year, instead of spending that money on formula and care for infectious diseases and treating people who get sick because they're not exclusively breastfeeding,
preventing it.
We could have the CDC and the World Health Organization. They could use that $300 billion. So there's a financial interest there for them to promote it, I guess, but maybe it's just not direct.
Yeah,
it's not a direct financial interest. So I don't know. I just kind of thought that was
it's a little concerning. I think
kind of interesting why they're not promoting. Anyway, but so I mean, when you compare infants who were breastfed with no supplements at all, and after adjusting for a variety of different variables in the research, those who were completely weaned from breastfeeding early had 14 times and 3.6 times the risk of death from diarrhea and respiratory infections. So let me clarify that. Why don't you say this one?
The children who were not exclusively breastfed, so they were completely weaned before that 6-month period, had a 14 times risk of death from diarrhea and a 3.6 times the risk of death from respiratory infections.
Okay.
So compared to the children who were breastfed, the ones who had any kind of supplement or were completely weaned had this much higher risk of death from particular diseases, including respiratory infections and from diarrhea. And it said cow's milk, formula milk seemed to be equally hazardous. So when comparing all substances here for them to be taking in, there was a much higher risk of disease, again, from not being exclusively breastfed.
Yes. All right. Thanks for clarifying. So then,
well, let me say one more thing too. This was not just based on numbers, but one of these studies says the important role of appropriate breastfeeding practices in the survival of infants is clear from this analysis. The reduction of associated respiratory infection deaths underscores the broad-based beneficial effect of exclusive breastfeeding in prevention of infectious diseases. Again, exclusive breastfeeding in prevention of infectious diseases, which is the goal. They're saying that breastfeeding can reduce and prevent infectious diseases. And just so you know, every single thing that we're bringing up here is from a separate study. These are not all bullet points from one study. Right. These are all individual studies that have all said the same thing. So if you keep hearing reduction of, diarrhea and respiratory tract infections, that's because so many different sources over the last 15 to 20 years have studied this and found it to be true. So just in case you're hearing it again thinking, oh, she already said that before. Yeah, another study came out checking their database and found out it's actually true again, and it continues to be true. And that should be concerning that it keeps saying the same thing. It keeps saying the same thing because they're finding it to be true again and again.
All right. So this next one, this next study found kind of they sort of calculated the risk of dying from diarrhea in the first 6 months of life only. And it looks like the data from this one study showed that breastfeeding reduces diarrhea deaths by about 25% in just the first 6 months of life. Right.
Yeah,
which is that's a small benefit if you're looking at just the first 6 months. But when they look at overall, the earlier study showed that breastfeeding, if you're not breastfeeding, your risk of death from diarrhea is 14 times greater.
Times, right.
I guess probably not just as an infant in the first 6 months, but over your whole childhood.
And then in Latin America, in another study that they did, they actually found that 66% of infant deaths from diarrhea disease and respiratory infections are preventable. 66% of all infant deaths from diarrhea disease and respiratory infections, this is in Latin America, is completely preventable by exclusive breastfeeding. And so this study says promotion of breastfeeding has an important role in increasing the survival of infants. And if you look at, we're talking about two-thirds of all those deaths, they're saying could have been avoided.
All right.
And I feel like when you look at the data of infant mortality, you have people looking at those numbers saying this is because they weren't vaccinated. And this is because the vaccine percentages aren't high enough in those areas. When what they're saying is it has nothing to do with vaccine percentages. It has to do with whether or not they were exclusively breastfed. You know what I'm saying? Like if you look at infant mortality numbers, somebody might say, look at all these babies dying in Latin America. And they're saying that because they'll allude and connect that's because, look, their vaccine rates are only 70%. They need to be 80% or they need to be 90%. But in reality, what this study is saying, 2/3 of all those deaths, we're talking about respiratory infections, not that they need a vaccine for it, but 2/3 of those respiratory deaths from respiratory infections could have been completely avoided if the child was exclusively breastfed, just even in the first 6 months.
Right.
I mean, that's pretty big, don't you think? Like,
yes.
This is not something you hear from the CDC or the World Health Organization. They don't really promote this information about breastfeeding and the reduction of infant disease and the reduction of infectious disease.
Right. I know. And another interesting study showed basically 16% of newborn deaths could be saved if all infants were breastfed starting right on day one, and about 20 2% of newborn deaths could be saved if every baby started breastfeeding within the first hour of
Isn't
life.
that, I mean, just 1 out of 5 could be saved just
Right.
if they would have been put on the breast
Right.
within the first hour.
Yeah, but it's interesting. Yeah, like if and everyone talks about what's called the golden hour when a baby's born, how important it is for the baby to be put onto mom's chest and for there to be skin to skin contact, no medical interventions, no shots, nothing done in that first hour except for for that baby to be on mom and for that baby to start breastfeeding.
Mm-hmm.
And the research shows that if you can get a baby to breastfeed within the first hour, you're saving more deaths compared to even if that baby breastfeeds when they're 2 hours old,
Right.
or 3 hours old. There's actually a benefit from that exact first hour, which I find
And nobody really
amazing.
talks about these neonatal deaths as it relates to breastfeeding. But I thought that study was really interesting when I came. They said that promotion of that early initiation of breastfeeding has that potential to make a major contribution to the achievement of the Child Survival Millennium Development Goal. Their goal to have our infant mortality rates, especially in the United States of all places, which should be a lot lower than it is. Our infant mortality rate is higher than it should be and higher than several other industrialized nations. And there's no need for that. There's something going on that's happening in that early couple of days that is not allowing for the best chance of survival for the infants. And we need to get to that. And this particular study is advocating for early initiation of breastfeeding to make that kind of difference with neonatal deaths and reducing the neonatal deaths.
Yeah, and what I find very fascinating and how this ties into vaccines a little bit is we have so many research studies that have shown how much breastfeeding reduces mortality and just reduces infectious diseases in general. I don't remember ever reading any research studies that has proven fully vaccinated children have a lower mortality rate. Studies that show if you follow the CDC schedule that we're reducing, child mortality in the U.S. by 50% or by 10% or even 5%.
Or by giving the hepatitis B vaccine on day 2, we're reducing infant mortality by this rate.
Right.
Yeah, we don't have that.
Right.
Those studies.
Exactly. We don't. And people have to have done that research. I mean, people must have tried to prove through many times that full vaccination reduces mortality rates, and I wonder, the only reason I can think of is why that's not published is that they don't like the results they're finding.
Right.
They can't do a study that proves lower mortality rates in fully vaccinated versus partially vaccinated or unvaccinated kids. And I find that kind of a little ironic, I guess.
Well, in infant mortality rates, I mean, that should be the goal. The goal is to reduce infectious diseases, to reduce infant mortality. We do have all these studies that are showing us just exclusive breastfeeding can do that. And this is, when I made a post about this is what I was thinking was, can you imagine if the CDC spent the kind of money they do on marketing for like the flu shot and took that money and marketed this type of support for breastfeeding?
Right.
Marketed it, actually spent money, had clinics, had things where people could come in and explain their issues, could talk, supported finding their La Leche leagues and breastfeeding support and things like that. If they spent the same kind of money instead of advertising for the vaccine to prevent the infant death to supporting the breastfeeding that was going to save that infant, according to this research, save that infant from lots of different potential infections and for their life, why wouldn't they do that?
I know, and it's crazy. And plus we have, hundreds of research studies that proves exclusive breastfeeding reduces mortality. And we don't have data showing that the flu vaccine reduces mortality in infants. And so it drives me crazy that they're spending, hundreds of millions of dollars promoting something that they don't have data that even shows it's going to help while they ignore something that they do have data on.
And the flu vaccine we know has side effects. Breastfeeding does not. So it's like, at least you could be promoting something that has no adverse events where you were promoting something so greatly, something that does have severe adverse events for many people. Something seems very strange there. One thing I saw with the American Academy of Pediatrics is that they did cite this study, and I've seen this particular study cited a couple times, It says exclusive breastfeeding until the age of 4 months and partially thereafter was associated with a significant reduction of respiratory and gastrointestinal morbidity in infants. Our findings support health policy strategies to promote exclusive breastfeeding for at least 4 months, but preferably 6 months in industrialized countries. Okay, we're not talking about poor, undeveloped countries here. This study, and I've seen this study several times, this exact particular study, has found that in industrialized countries, countries with good sanitation, with good medical care, with economies that are thriving, in those countries, what they are saying is that even in those countries, there is respiratory morbidity and gastrointestinal morbidity that's happening in infants, and that it could be reduced and prevented if there was a health policy in place that promoted exclusive breastfeeding for at least 4 months, but they found even 6 months to be more beneficial. I mean, now this is the first time I saw them talk about gastrointestinal morbidity, but of course they're probably relating also to tying in with diarrhea. But gastrointestinal health is so important. And like you mentioned, gastrointestinal health, this is the reason that breastfeeding is so crucial for infants, because it helps to develop their gut in a way that makes them healthier and makes them stronger when it comes to any type of infectious disease that they come in contact with. Now, this study is even supported by the AAP, and it was promoted on one of their pages. And yet, again, you know, when I had my first, and our pediatrician at the time, not once did he tell me, hey, by the way, just so you know, and he was promoting breastfeeding, but he never said, the breastfeeding that you're doing is actually reducing the risk of infant mortality for your child. The breastfeeding that you're doing is actually reducing the risk of respiratory infections and morbidity in your infant. He never told me that. And then when I was complaining about the fact that my supply was low, I wasn't sure if I was going to need to supplement with something, he led me to their products. Instead of telling me, no, Melissa, I got you, okay? We're gonna get on this together. You're almost there. She's 4 months old. A couple more months and you will really have at least given her what she needed. We will help support you. The data is there to show that this is the best choice for you, and I'm right here. We'll be holding your hand through it. Yeah. That never came up, and we're talking about Southern California, where we have access. You know, people think a lot of hippies are here, right? We've got a lot of people who are into holistic health. How is that still not part of health policy? And this study says the findings are supporting health policy strategy. Please, they're telling you, please promote exclusive breastfeeding, doctors. Doctors, please look at what we found. This is important, and it's not happening. But you know what they do promote? They promote well visit checks with lots of vaccines, because that's the thing that was promoted to me. And it was promoted over and over again, where this was not. And we're talking about this can reduce infant mortality. And I would say in a much higher way than even the vaccines for those particular infections would have for my child in that same period of time.
Right.
And it's it's kind of infuriating. As I speak with a calm voice, because Dr. Bob says I'm no longer allowed to rant on this podcast.
No,
he doesn't want me to scare anyone away. However, I know there are some people out there that are putting their hand in the air saying, yes, exactly. Amen to that. Amen. Preach. Essentially, preach, sister. Because this, so we all knew these things, right? But like you see it in black and white in study after study after study, and you're saying, why is this not on the news? Why is this not the story they're covering instead of the one that says so-and-so got measles and it's because of the unvaccinated? Like, how are they not focusing on this? Let's give our children the best start against infectious diseases from the beginning. And then let's talk about what other interventions need to be added. Yeah. Maybe there'll be fewer. Maybe you won't need as many medical interventions, right?
Right. Yeah, and I like this one study. It talks about that not only does breastfeeding exclusively reduce gastrointestinal infections and respiratory infections, most doctors only think that's all it does. That breastfeeding only helps prevent those two types of infections. But research actually shows that exclusive breastfeeding reduces meningitis brain infections. It reduces bacteremia, which is where you get a bacteria that kind of invades through your lungs or through your gut and gets into your bloodstream. And then you kind of go into shock and you have to be hospitalized and get IV antibiotics. Breastfeeding even helps prevent those diseases
and pneumonia
as well. And pneumonia as well, which is respiratory, but it's like when a respiratory infection gets more complicated and it turns into pneumonia. So yeah, it's amazing.
And on top of that, they mention chronic diseases later in life.
Oh yes.
At the end of that. So they said not only is it reducing the diarrhea and the respiratory tract infections that are causing mortality in infants, not only that, it's also reducing pneumonia and meningitis, and it's reducing the frequency of certain chronic diseases later in life, meaning it's not just about infancy. This sets you up for a healthier life into adulthood. Mm-hmm. And this is why this is so important. But I will say, I'm going to skip to, I want to come back to those, but I want to skip to something, and I'm going to see if I put it in here, because I didn't write it in my post. But there was something I found really interesting. Okay. Right here. This is a study that was done in the UK. And this is what it said. It said, in low-income countries, most infants are still breastfed at 1 year. So in low-income countries, most infants are still breastfed at 1 year. And in the high-income countries, it is less than 20%.
Wow.
And in the UK, less than 1%.
Wow.
So what they said it is ironic that in the poor areas, they're actually giving their child better health measures because they're continuing to breastfeed. We have access to the medical care in the industrialized countries, and yet we are not using breastfeeding as a tool to keep our children healthy. And so this is what they said. They said the reason why women avoid or stop breastfeeding range from medical, cultural, psychological to physical discomfort and inconvenience. These are the reasons that it's quoted that breastfeeding is stopped. It said these matters are not trivial, and it says many mothers without support turn to a bottle of formula, multiplied across populations and involving multinational commercial interests. This situation has catastrophic consequences on breastfeeding rates and the health of subsequent generations. So they said urgent commitment is needed from government to establish, quote, a new normal where every woman can expect to breastfeed and receive every support that she needs. They're saying, please, governments, get involved. The new normal should be breastfeeding and support for breastfeeding. And that is not what they're seeing, and that's not what they're seeing in high-income countries. They're seeing lower than 20%, in some cases all the way down to 1% at the 1 year mark. And that is just abysmally low.
Yeah.
And shockingly low, yeah. I think most people think breastfeeding's on the rise. They think, I hear about this all the time in holistic groups. And yes, but overall, in industrialized nations, the breastfeeding rates are too low. And overall, we're having this increase in child mortality and infant mortality. And so you're looking at that saying, where's the connection? And then on top of that, our vaccine doses are, through the roof. And I feel like this is just totally backwards.
Yeah.
As far as how we're approaching this. What do you think?
Yeah, and I is sort of where the saying, it takes a village to raise a child, and every mom needs a lot of support and help. And I think as growing, I grew up in a what we call a La Leche League family. My mom was a La Leche League leader, and La Leche League, La Leche is the milk in Spanish, if you don't know. And La Leche League is a international organization geared to help new moms succeed at breastfeeding and to support their breastfeeding for the long term and to encourage exclusive long-term breastfeeding.
And by long term, we mean 2 to 3 years,
yes,
right?
Yeah, mm-hmm. 2 or longer.
Yeah.
And so I grew up in that household. So for me, this was the norm. But what I loved watching my wife Cheryl in her years as a La Leche League leader, how she would just be on the phone helping a new mom almost every day. She would get a call and a new mom says, help, my 2-year-old is having trouble. And Cheryl would spend an hour on the phone with that mom help, walk her through it. And then they would have monthly meetings in our house or in other people's houses, and monthly meetings where new moms come and learn about breastfeeding, and veteran moms come and help other new moms. And it's basically the La Leche League creates these little villages for new moms to go to.
Well, because the
and
problems
get the help.
shift. As you are breastfeeding at the beginning, the problems that you have
Right.
are different than the problems you might have as you move along, as your child gets a little bit older.
And so it's this whole group of women that spend 2, 3, 4, 5 years in a La Leche League meeting with the same women and families over and over again, helping each other. But then new moms come in and they help those new moms. And to have an organization like La Leche League, I think is amazing. And I feel like, it just blows my mind that I guess that governments don't utilize like an organization that's already in place like that. And how can we get every single new mom in touch with La Leche League? Because most people are born in hospitals, and hospitals kind of have their own, breastfeeding classes and their own, prenatal
Lactation
classes.
consultants.
Yeah, those are great. It's amazing for hospitals to have lactation consultants. But when you don't have the mom-to-mom support,
That's true.
you're not like a village. You're just getting support from the hospital,
And you're less likely
and then you're
to-
gone.
yeah,
And then
yeah.
you're gone. They're not in your life. But when you have something like La Leche League in your life, I think it makes a huge difference. And I still have there's many patients, but there's one patient I can think of in particular. I just saw her child was 16 years old, and she tells me, I remember when she was 2 days old, I called the Leche League, and your wife answered and helped me and got me, to succeed at breastfeeding. And your wife is the reason, why I breastfed my child for many years, and why she's healthy today. And I love hearing those kinds of stories. And so I think we really do need to adopt the village approach to this. And again, we would be a lot healthier for it as a society.
There are two last studies that I think we should go through. I want you to do that one right there, but
Okay.
I'll do this one first,
Okay.
and then you can finish on that. Here's something I found interesting in this study. This study says disease prevention is critically important to individual and public health. So that's something we know, right? We hear often with the vaccine issue, this is a public health issue. So disease prevention, yes, is public health. So this is what they say. They say breastfeeding is well known to provide immune protection and prevent various diseases in the perinatal period. Human breast milk is also accepted as the best nutritional source for the neonate and infant, and it provides other widely accepted benefits to the mother and the child. It says breastfeeding provides unsurpassed natural nutrition to the newborn and infant. Human breast milk also contains numerous protective factors against infectious disease, and it may influence immune system development. Actual development of the immune system for the infant. It says premature cessation of breastfeeding could lay the groundwork for later dysfunction in the immunologic controls necessary to prevent autoimmune disease or hypersensitivity reactions.
Wow.
Think about that last line. Premature cessation of breastfeeding could lay the groundwork for later dysfunction in the immunologic controls necessary to prevent autoimmune disease or hypersensitivity reactions. This is why breastfeeding is important. Not only is it preventing infectious disease, but it is laying the groundwork for your child's immune system so that they can prevent things like autoimmune disease in the future. And it reduces, like we said in that last study, reduces chronic disease later in life. Why is this not on the front page of CNN every single day? Hey, moms,
Right.
we support you. Instead, what you see is some mom getting in trouble for breastfeeding in public. And it's like,
Yes.
what you should be seeing is them, hey, guess what? We support these studies that paid millions of dollars to find this information out. Guess what? We support you. As a society, you're doing the best you can. And I will say, too, to a mom who maybe has a new baby right now and is struggling, 6 months, if that's all that you can do, it goes by fast. That's something I know you can get through. You can get through 6 months, and usually after that 6 month period, it gets easier. And once it gets easier, you'll find yourself getting to go until 12 months. And even though it seems like such an arduous and uphill battle, this is crucial for the child, for their future. And I want to say, I know you can do it. I know these moms can do it. I want there to be a support system in place for them because I struggled and I had nobody to go to. I didn't know about any support groups, any leagues. I just happened to be a very determined person, but not everybody is so determined and not everybody has the educational background to understand why this is important. So we need to help each other. Other moms need to support other moms, not just in saying, it's okay, don't worry if you're not going to do this, I'm not going to shame you. Not that kind of support, the kind of support that says, I'm not going to judge you or shame you, but I also want to support you and arm you and help you get to this goal. Get to this goal for your child, get to this goal for you.
Right. Thank you. I'll finish.
Dr. Bob, I want to support you in your breastfeeding journey. I want you to be supported in your breastfeeding. I know it's hard.
Is it really that hard?
It must be really easy, right?
So this last study, but I guess before I say this last study, I guess I want to say that when we post this podcast episode, we'll probably have to team it up with a Facebook post specifically
with the
geared
links
towards this episode, where we'll have all the links to all these studies.
Yes.
So you can have just this huge long list of breastfeeding research studies all in one place. Because I know we're not telling you the titles of each of these studies, but this is an amazing result from a study that I found very, very fascinating. And thanks for finding this, Melissa. So basically, hospital, doctor, and clinic visits for 4 or more respiratory infections were significantly greater if breastfeeding was stopped before 2 months, or if partial breastfeeding was stopped before 6 months. So basically, if you stop breastfeeding or mostly stop breastfeeding by 2 months, or you are only or you stop partial breastfeeding by 6 months, you are going to have 4 or more. You're going to have 4 more visits to the doctor. Is that right? Yeah, you're going to have 4 more visits to the doctor or the emergency room or any sort of clinic for respiratory infections if you stop breastfeeding early. If you stop breastfeeding for less than 6 months, you will have an increased risk for 2 or more hospital, doctor, clinic visits and hospital admissions for wheezing. All right, if you stop breastfeeding early before 6 months, more likely to have wheezing problems. Breastfeeding for less than 8 months was associated with a significantly increased risk of 2 or more hospital or doctor visits or hospital admissions, again, because of wheezing infections again. So I guess there are 2 different studies that showed that, either stopping breastfeeding at 6 months or stopping breastfeeding at 8 months. So, I mean, you really are, raising your risk of having these significant infections and ending up in the hospital or ending up at the doctor if you stop early.
And I'll add to this one last study that kind of talks about several different parts of the world and what that risk looks like. They said that in developed settings, twice the hospitalization rates and more severe illness from lower respiratory tract infections.
In developed settings.
This is in developed settings.
Right.
In developing countries, the mortality risk is 4-fold. That's mortality. Mm-hmm. The relative risks in Finland in infants were 3 to 4 times the relative risk for ear infections. Bacterial meningitis had a 4-fold risk for hospitalization in a Connecticut study. Human milk, it said, prevented the bacteremia, is that what you said?
Right.
Before in prematures in British neonatal units, a 20-fold reduction in deaths in a Philippine study of breastfeeding, 20-fold reduction of neonatal deaths, 20-fold. Wow. And it says in the U.S., the relative risk is about 4 times for diarrheal mortality in the U.S. So, I mentioned the development settings, but that's because they were really trying to cover the world in this. This is literally covering the globe. And so people think this is just developing nations that have this issue. It's not. We're talking about, developed. Yeah, not underdeveloped, but underdeveloped and developed nations. And then this is the other thing. They talk about SIDS. And in this particular study, they say it's about 1/5 less common in breastfed babies. 1/5 less common, according to this. And there's another study that mentions SIDS being a reduction of 50% in breastfed babies. Excellent. This also goes on to talk about a reduction in celiac disease, Crohn's disease, colitis, thyroid disease, chronic liver disease, food allergies.
Diabetes.
Yeah, these are the things that are reduced by the breastfeeding. So it's not just one or two things. We're talking about, this is an overall health in developed nations, in underdeveloped nations. It's U.S., it's around the world, it's everywhere. And the one contraindication that I noticed on the CDC's page for breastfeeding mentioned HIV positive mothers. I did find a study that talked about HIV, and they talked about a particular type of prophylaxis that they've developed with HIV positive mothers that they said when given to children that were breastfed from the HIV positive mother that took this particular prophylaxis, the infant mortality at 7 months, by 7 months old, was significantly higher for the formula fed group than the group that was breastfed. And so this is in Africa. So we're talking about infant mortality completely decreased even in that situation. And that was a situation that was one of the contraindications according to the CDC.
Right.
So
it's very, the issue of HIV positive women and breastfeeding is very complicated. It's very fascinating. But yeah, they actually found in underdeveloped countries like Africa, if a mom is HIV positive, her baby is more likely to survive and live and thrive and grow up to be healthy if that mom breastfed, even though she's HIV positive, even without giving the baby any prophylactic medications for HIV. Just simply the act of breastfeeding raised the survival rate of those babies. And so they actually encouraged moms in Africa who were HIV positive to go ahead and breastfeed because it would be more likely to save the baby's life than if they formula fed that baby.
Right.
And the baby, may or may not become HIV positive, but they're going to survive more.
Yeah, right.
So in the U.S., the authorities like the CDC, they're reluctant to encourage HIV positive moms to breastfeed because they're worried that the breastfeeding is going to transmit HIV to the baby, and they would rather the baby not acquire HIV, of course. So they feel in a developed country like ours, the baby's better off formula feeding instead of breastfeeding from that HIV positive mom. And people debate this. And I'll be honest, I don't know exactly what the right answer is. I mean, of course, even in the U.S., if an HIV positive mom breastfeeds, her baby's going to get tons of benefits from that breast milk.
To prevent mortality from other things.
From all kinds of other things. But then is the risk of HIV significant enough to change that recommendation? And I'm not going to make a recommendation here because that's not appropriate. But it's not just black and white.
Yeah.
It's not just cut and dry.
Well, that's what I thought was interesting is I did notice that contraindication on the CDC website, and I was surprised to see that also in a study talking about the benefit of still breastfeeding and the reduction of infant mortality in areas like Africa.
Yeah.
And there's so much data on this. I mean, obviously, this is just the studies that I came across when taking a couple days to really look at specifically breastfeeding and how it relates to infectious disease. And more than anything, it's not so much about convincing moms to breastfeed. It's more about the understanding that there are other ways to prevent infectious disease. And there are other ways to focus on keeping our children healthy and to reduce infant mortality rates than just vaccines and more vaccines and more vaccines and increasing more doses. There are other things we should be doing as a nation to be promoting the health of our citizens and across the world in all of the other countries as well. And I found all this stuff very interesting. I mean, obviously, I'm proud I was able to breastfeed both of my kids. It was very hard, and it was, I would say, to date, probably my greatest accomplishment of my life. And I've done some cool things, but I will say, and I've said it to my husband, this is the greatest accomplishment of my life, sticking with it. And I didn't really have a lineage that was all pro breastfeeding. It's not like I had, my mom wasn't in a little HA league. I didn't grow up with that knowledge. I sort of came across it in the holistic communities. And I was really alone in doing this, but I really want to see more support for this because not only is it helping in all these other areas, but it's definitely preventing infant mortality and infectious disease. And that's what we talk about here on the vaccine conversation.
I know. And I guess I want to just tie in how vaccines relate to this is okay. First of all, we have breastfeeding greatly reduces immediate, infant mortality from infant infections, but it also reduces your risk of all those long-term chronic adult diseases like celiac, Crohn's, colitis, diabetes, thyroid, lymphoma, liver disease, eczema, and food allergies. Breastfeeding exclusively for a prolonged period of time will make it more likely that you will live your entire life without any of those diseases growing up. That's how important it is. Mm-hmm. And what I find, again, to tie in the vaccine issue is when you're making vaccine decisions for your children, you might decide you want to do vaccines so that your child is less likely to suffer mortality from one of those specific diseases. But we know from a lot of research that vaccines do raise your risk of some of these chronic diseases.
Right. For later in life.
Right, for later in life. So part of your vaccine decision is not only is what's best for your baby right now, but what is best for your child who will be an adult someday. And it's kind of a trade-off. And you really have to consider those long-term risks when it comes to deciding whether or not to vaccinate. But this isn't a vaccine episode, I know, but
it's all connected.
It is all connected. You want to make the decisions for your child that are going to be best for their entire life, whether it's nutrition, healthcare, natural living, etc. So you want to make those choices.
And I would love to hear people's comments and input on this one. What have your experiences been, the listeners? Mm-hmm. What was your breastfeeding journey like? Did you have support? I would love to hear about it. Come to our Immunity Education Facebook page, and we'll post this when this episode goes live. We'll post a new thread for this and comment on there. I'd love to hear what your feelings are as it relates to this. Are you surprised that this kind of data exists? Have you ever heard of this before? Was your doctor telling you about this? Let's open up that conversation to you guys, and make sure to review and rate our podcast as well, so other people can see what you have found beneficial in this. We would love that on iTunes. Make sure to rate and review it, and we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah. Okay, well, we will see you guys next time for the next episode on the vaccine conversation.
The information in this podcast is for entertainment purposes only. It is not intended as medical advice. Always consult your healthcare professional for information on vaccines and infectious diseases.